Hi everyone, I'm Sarah from Green City Growers, and today I'm going to be teaching you how to maintain a worm bin and how to start one for yourself. So this is one of our worm bins. We cover it with this dark fabric because it's a lighter color and the worms really prefer darkness. Now let's open it up and see what it looks like inside. So this is what it's looking like inside of our worm bin. You can see there's some paper, some food in different stages of decay, and all of this material that looks like soil is actually worm castings. And this is what we'll eventually harvest to use as fertilizer in our gardens. So I like to check on the worm bin at least once a week. You might do it more often if you're adding food every day. And when I first open it up, I like to turn over all of the castings, fluff it up, get some air circulation in there. The reason that I'm turning everything over is because it can get really compacted at the bottom, and we don't want that. We want airspace between all the material so that the worms can breathe. Something that I'm also doing while I'm turning this over is I'm checking for the moisture. You don't want your worm bin to be wet and soggy, but you also don't want it to be too dry either. And you'll get a feel for this the more that you work with it, but you'll also get some cues from the worms. So if you see any climbing up the walls trying to escape, that usually means it's either too dry or too wet. So I like to feed the worms at least once a week. And when I do this, I add some plant matter, like some vegetable scraps, and some paper to control the moisture. Some things you can feed your worm bin include raw fruit and vegetable scraps, coffee grounds, tea bags if you remove the staple, lawn clippings, newspaper, paper towels. Some things you definitely don't want to put in your worm bin are citrus fruits, alliums, which is the plant family that includes garlic and onions, and spicy foods. Those are all irritating to the worms and they won't eat them. We also recommend not putting meat or dairy products in the worm bin. Worms technically can eat these, but it will produce a strong odor, and if you're keeping your worm bin in your home, that's not going to be pleasant. Today I'm going to be feeding the worms some lettuce that's bolted in the garden, so rather than it go to waste, we'll compost it and feed it to the worms. For this lettuce, I'm just going to tear it up into smaller pieces. If you're feeding them something larger like a cucumber or a potato or banana, I would slice it up into smaller pieces. It'll just make it easier for the worms to break it down. They could break down something larger, but it'll just take much longer. Now I'm going to bring you back over so you can see how I feed them. When you're adding new food to the worm bin, you want to bury it about an inch below the surface. This will prevent any odor and also should prevent fruit flies from being attracted to your bin. So I'm just going to make a little section where I can bury everything. I'll also bury some of this other food that hasn't been digested yet. And then we'll just cover it up. Something else I mentioned is adding paper. So you can use newspaper, cardboard, or any type of paper as long as it's not glossy, and you want to make sure you remove any staples first. So I have some paper that was just going to be recycled, so I've cut some strips, and I'm just going to add this. This is something that the worms will eat, and it also helps control moisture in the bin. So if you're finding that your bin is too wet, you can add more paper, and if you're feeling like it's too dry, I would stay away from adding too much paper. So as you can see, I've just added a light layer of paper on the top. Some of this I just ripped up, some of it I cut up. If you have a paper shredder, that works great too. My bin right now is basically right at the moisture that I want, If it was a little too moist, I would add even more paper and I would mix it in with the other material. But since we're right where we want it, I'm just gonna add a little layer on top. But we still wanna make sure that we wet this paper. Worms actually breathe out of their skin, so if you have any dry paper in there, it can actually suffocate the worms. They need it to be wet to be able to glide past it. So I'm just gonna mist it with some water. If you prefer to wet it before, or if you don't have a mist bottle, you can soak the paper for about a minute and then squeeze it out so that it's damp but not soggy, and then you can add it in. So that's about it for worm maintenance. Then I would just cover this up, put it back in its place, and check out again next week or the next time that I want to add some food scraps. Now let's talk about how to start one of these worm bins for yourself. The first step is to choose a container. You can choose anything from a small shoebox sized container to something larger like this. You want it to be opaque, and plastic works great. When you're thinking about the size of the bin that you want to consider how much food scraps you'll want to feed it and where you have room for it in the house. We recommend keeping the worm bin inside because if you keep it outside, the food scraps could attract pests like mice and other rodents, so it's better to keep it inside. And since it should have no odor, it shouldn't be disturbing. There are a few things you have to do to prep your bin first. The first is to add some ventilation holes. So we have these 1/4-inch holes drilled around the perimeter of the top to provide some air circulation and ventilation for the worms. Another thing you'll want to add is some drainage holes in the bottom. So for this, we used 1/8 of an inch and we drilled them all along the bottom. This is to let some of the moisture leak out. And when you're storing your bin, you can store it on a tray, which will catch what leaks out, and you can actually use that material to make compost tea. You just add it to some water, and then you can use it in your garden. And the last thing you'll have to add are these feet on the bottom to keep it just off the ground. You can use any spare wood that you have, and you just want to make sure that you're drilling down through the bin into the blocks, not the other way around, because we don't want those sharp screws sticking up into the worm bin. Don't worry about any worms escaping from the drainage holes. Worms prefer a dark and moist environment, so they won't try and escape. When you're drilling into plastic, you want to make sure that your battery of your drill is fully charged and you have a sharp bit. Some of these containers are a little bit flexible, so you might find that they're a little tricky to drill into. If you find that it's too flexible, you can always put something stable behind it, like a block of wood, clamp it on there, and it'll be much easier to drill into. Also, another consideration, I know I showed that on our white worm bin, we covered it with a black cloth to keep out any additional light. If you choose a darker colored container like this, you wouldn't have to do that. Then once your bin is all ready, you can prepare the bedding for your worms. The initial bedding that you want to prepare is some paper, like newspaper or cardboard. You want to shred it or cut it up into small pieces, soak it for about a minute, and then wring it out. You want it to be damp but not soggy, like just moist enough that it won't stick to the worms. Then you should fill your worm bin about halfway and fluff that material up so there's lots of air space between the pieces. Then you're ready to add your worms. The worms that we use are red wriggler worms. They're sometimes called red worms or manure worms, and they're the best kind of worms for a worm bin. That's because they don't need a lot of depth to burrow, and they're also really quick at turning over organic material. If you're starting with the 12-gallon worm bin, you can order about a pound of worms, which is about 1,000 worms. The worms are really easy to order online, but if you have a friend that already has a worm bin, you can take a scoop of their worms and some compost and add it into your bin. Worms will self-regulate their population, so you don't have to worry about them overproducing. They'll produce based on the food source and the space that they have to grow. Once you add your worms with the initial bedding, you also want to add some food scraps. If you have a 12-gallon worm bin, it should be able to compost about a pound of food per day, but you do need to slowly work up to that amount. It takes some time for the worm bin to build up some bacteria that will help the worms break everything down. You can start with a little bit of food, and then once you see that that's all digested, you can add some more. If you're finding that there's a bad smell or there's a bunch of food that hasn't been digested, I would pause on adding any more until the worms have some time to catch up. Once your bin is all ready and your worms are fed, you can store your bin. When choosing where to store your bin, you want to consider air ventilation and sunlight. You want it to be a well-ventilated area, and you don't want it to be in direct sunlight. About 55 to 75 degrees is the ideal temperature for a worm bin, so you don't want it too hot or too cold. And make sure to store your worm bin on some tray or a mat to catch that drainage for your compost heap. And now you're probably wondering when you get your compost and how to harvest it. It takes about 3 to 6 months for your compost to be ready to harvest. When you're harvesting, all the organic materials should be broken down, and it should just look like worm castings in there. I'm going to show you an example of how you can harvest it. Our worm bin has some not broken down pieces of food, so we would generally not harvest at this stage, but I'll just show you a method that you can use. So if you use some sort of tray, you can scoop out some of your castings. And in this case, if you were harvesting from the whole bin, you can scoop out all of them, and you'd form a large mound. Leave this mound to sit for a few minutes, and in that time, all of the worms will burrow down to the bottom because they want to get to the darkest place. Then you can either scoop some off the top to harvest, and then build another mound, wait again, or you can sift through until there's just worms left and you have all your compost separated. All right, now you're all set to go make your own worm bin at home. I hope you have fun with this project.